Stephen Miller walked into the CNN debate studio with his usual cold confidence, his pale complexion almost glowing under the bright lights. The former Trump advisor straightened his dark suit and surveyed the room like he owned it. He had just spent the last 10 minutes backstage telling his team how he was about to school Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on immigration policy. "She's just another progressive who doesn't understand the real world," he smirked, adjusting his tie. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave Miller completely speechless and change everything. Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, calm and collected, her professional blazer perfectly pressed, a stack of documents in front of her that Miller hadn't noticed yet. She looked directly into the camera with a slight smile and said, "Before we start, let me ask everyone watching, comment below where you're from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to see is going to be unforgettable." Miller rolled his eyes, thinking this was just typical political theater. He had no idea that Crockett had spent the last 3 days preparing something that would expose his entire immigration narrative in front of millions of viewers. The documents in front of her contained information that would turn Miller from confident policy expert into a fumbling mess in record time. The studio fell silent as Anderson Cooper introduced both guests. Miller leaned forward, ready to deliver what he thought would be a masterclass in immigration policy. But Crockett was already 3 steps ahead, and Miller was about to learn why underestimating her was the biggest mistake of his political career. This wasn't just going to be a debate. This was about to become Miller's worst nightmare, broadcast live to the entire nation. Stephen Miller had built his reputation as Trump's immigration hardliner, the architect behind some of the most controversial border policies in recent history. At 38, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his Harvard law degree and years in the White House made him untouchable in any policy debate. He had appeared on countless news shows, always with the same strategy: overwhelm opponents with rapid-fire statistics and legal jargon that made them look unprepared. Miller's team had specifically requested this debate because they saw Crockett as an easy target. "She's a freshman congresswoman from Texas," his communications director had told him earlier that day. "You'll destroy her on immigration. This will be great for your media profile." But Miller had made a critical error. He had completely underestimated who Jasmine Crockett really was. At 33, Crockett was a former civil rights attorney who had spent over a decade fighting immigration cases in Texas courts before winning her congressional seat. She had personally represented hundreds of families separated by immigration policies, many of them directly impacted by Miller's own handiwork during his White House years. Unlike other politicians who relied on talking points, Crockett knew immigration law inside and out because she had lived it, breathed it, and fought it in courtrooms across the state. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Miller needed this appearance to rehabilitate his image for a potential return to government. His book deal and speaking fees depended on maintaining his reputation as a policy genius. Meanwhile, Crockett was facing her own pressure. Progressive. Voters wanted to see her take down Trump-era officials, and she knew this was her chance to hold Miller accountable for policies that had torn families apart. As the cameras rolled, Miller sat back confidently, completely unaware that Crockett had done something no other opponent had ever done. She had actually read every single policy memo Miller had written during his White House tenure. And she had found something devastating. The tension in the studio was electric, but only one person knew what was really about to happen. Miller thought he was walking into a routine political debate. Crockett knew she was about to deliver justice. Anderson. Cooper started with what seemed like a simple question about border security, and Miller immediately launched into his typical performance. His voice took on that familiar tone, sharp, condescending, and filled with the kind of confidence that had intimidated other opponents for years. "Anderson, what we're seeing at the border is a complete failure of democratic policies," Miller began, his pale hands gesturing dramatically. "When I was in the White House, we had the most secure border in American history. We implemented policies based on law and order, not emotion and political correctness. He turned toward Crockett with a smirk that had become his trademark. Now we have Congresswoman here who I'm sure means well, but she simply doesn't understand the complexities of immigration law. These progressive talking points might play well on Twitter, but they don't work in the real world. The studio audience stirred slightly. Miller's supporters in the crowd nodded approvingly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cooper tried to redirect to Crockett, but Miller wasn't finished. "Let me give you some real numbers, Congresswoman," Miller continued, pulling out his phone as if he was about to cite statistics. "During our administration, illegal border crossings dropped by 85%. We implemented Remain in Mexico, we built the wall, and we enforced the law. Can you say the same about your party's policies?" Miller sat back, clearly expecting Crockett to fumble with some generic response about compassion and human rights. This was his usual strategy: hit hard with numbers and legal terminology, then watch his opponent struggle to keep up. But Crockett just smiled calmly and opened her folder. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate your confidence," she said, her voice steady and professional. "But before we talk about your statistics, I think the American people deserve to know about some of your actual policies. Not the talking points, but the real documents." Miller's expression changed slightly. Something in Crockett's tone suggested this wasn't going according to his usual script. "I don't know what you're talking about," Miller replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Crockett pulled out a document and held it up. "This is a memo you wrote in July 2019. Internal White House Communications. Would you like me to read from it?" The studio fell completely silent. Miller's face went from confident to confused to the first hint of panic. His team had never prepared him for an opponent who had actual documentation. "I'm not sure what game you're playing here," Miller said, trying to regain control. "But I'm not going to respond to out-of-context documents that could be fabricated." That was his second mistake of the night. Crockett's smile grew wider. "Fabricated?" she repeated. "Mr. Miller, this came directly from the National Archives. It's part of the public record now. But let me ask you this. Do you remember writing about acceptable losses when it came to family separation?" The audience gasped audibly. Miller's face went completely pale, which was saying something given his already ghostly complexion. He started to stammer. That's taken completely out of context. Immigration policy is complex, and you can't just cherry-pick phrases to make political points." But Crockett was just getting started. She pulled out another document. "How about this memo from August 2019, where you specifically argued against keeping better records of separated families because, and I quote, detailed tracking would create legal vulnerabilities for the administration?" Miller's hands began to shake slightly. This was information that was supposed to be buried in bureaucratic files. How had she gotten access to internal memos that his own team thought were safely hidden? "Congresswoman, you're clearly trying to score political points by misrepresenting policy discussions," Miller said, but his voice was cracking. These were complex legal and operational considerations. The camera zoomed in on Miller's face, capturing every bead of sweat that was starting to form on his forehead. Cooper tried to maintain order, but the tension in the room was building to a breaking point. Crockett leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Miller, I represented 12 families who lost track of their children because of policies you designed. 12 families who didn't know where their kids were for months. Would you like to tell them about operational considerations?" Miller opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, the man who had built his reputation on being the smartest person in the room was completely speechless. And Crockett wasn't done yet. The moment Miller hesitated, Crockett knew she had him exactly where she wanted him. She had spent years preparing for this moment, not just the 3 days before this debate, but the decade of immigration law that had brought her to Congress in the first place. "Mr. Miller, let me read you something else," Crockett said, pulling out a third document. This is from a text message thread between you and other administration officials. September 2018. Miller's eyes widened in genuine panic. Text messages meant this wasn't just policy memos. This was personal communication that revealed his actual thoughts, not just official positions. "I'm not going to dignify this ambush with a response," Miller said, trying to stand up from his chair. "This isn't a debate. It's a character assassination." "Sit down, Mr. Miller," Crockett said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. "You came here to debate immigration policy. Let's debate. Immigration policy. Cooper gestured for Miller to remain seated, and Miller reluctantly sat back down, his face now bright red with a combination of anger and embarrassment. Crockett continued reading. Quote, "The crying children make for bad optics, but we can't let emotion drive policy. Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. These people chose to come here illegally." End quote. The studio erupted. Several audience members audibly gasped, while others started whispering to each other. Miller looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. That's private communication taken completely out of context," Miller stammered. "You can't just violate privacy and then use selective quotes to destroy someone's reputation." Crockett looked directly into the camera. "Mr. Miller, these aren't private communications. These are official government records that the American people paid for and have a right to see." "And context?" She pulled out yet another document. "Let me give you context." Miller's hands were now visibly shaking. Whatever confidence he had walked into the studio with was completely gone. "This is a follow-up email you sent 2 days later," Crockett continued. Quote, "Legal is concerned about liability, but I think we can structure the separations to minimize future lawsuits. The key is limiting documentation and creating plausible bureaucratic explanations for why families can't be reunited quickly." End quote. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even Cooper, who had moderated hundreds of heated political debates, looked stunned. Miller tried one last desperate move. "Congresswoman, you're clearly trying to destroy me personally because you can't defend your party's failed policies. This is exactly the kind of political theater that Americans are tired of." But Crockett had been waiting for this moment. "Political theater," she repeated, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "Mr. Miller, I want you to look into this camera and tell Maria Santos that her policy was just political theater." Miller looked confused. "I don't know who that is." "Maria Santos is a mother from El Paso who didn't see her 4-year-old daughter for 8 months because of your policies." 8 months, Mr. Miller. That little girl forgot her mother's voice. Crockett stood up and walked closer to Miller's chair. "I want you to tell James Rodriguez that losing his 6-year-old son in the system was just breaking a few eggs. I want you to tell the 12 families I represented personally that their trauma was just bureaucratic efficiency." Miller was completely frozen. The man who had built his career on being the aggressive attacker was now being attacked by someone who had actually lived the consequences of his policies. I was implementing the law as written," Miller whispered. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "No, Mr. Miller," Crockett said, returning to her seat and pulling out one final document. "You were designing the law, and this final memo proves it." She held up a document with Miller's signature clearly visible at the bottom. "This is your recommendation to the Attorney General requesting expanded authority for family separation, dated 3 weeks before the policy was officially announced. Your own words, we need maximum flexibility to separate family units as a deterrent strategy." Miller stared at the document in horror. "How did you get that?" "I told you, Mr. Miller, public records. The National Archives released these documents last month as part of a Freedom of Information Act request. The same request I filed 2 years ago when I was still representing separated families in court." The realization hit Miller like a truck. This wasn't an ambush. This was preparation. Crockett had been building this case against him for years, and he had walked right into it. Cooper finally managed to regain control of the debate. "Mr. Miller, Would you like to respond to these documents? Miller looked around the studio like a trapped animal. His team in the back was frantically making hand gestures, but there was nothing they could do. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was all in Miller's own words. I stand by the policies of the Trump administration, Miller said weakly. We were securing the border and enforcing immigration law. Crockett leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile. Mr. Miller, let me ask you one final question. Are you proud of Maria Santos's daughter forgetting her mother's voice? Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. After 30 seconds of complete silence, he finally whispered, I think we're done here. But Crockett wasn't done. Mr. Miller, the American people deserve an answer. Are you proud of your work? Miller stood up, removed his microphone, and walked toward the exit. But before he could leave, Crockett delivered her final blow. For everyone watching at home, this is what accountability looks like. Mr. Miller designed policies that separated over 5,000 children from their families. He called it breaking a few eggs. Today, we showed him that those eggs were human beings. Miller stopped at the studio door, turned around one last time, and looked directly at Crockett. For a moment, it seemed like he might come back and continue the debate. Instead, he shook his head and walked out, leaving Crockett alone at the debate table. The studio erupted in applause, but Crockett didn't smile. She had won the debate, but the families she represented were still dealing with the trauma Miller had caused. Cooper turned to the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. We'll be right back after this commercial break. But the real show was just beginning on social media. Within minutes of Miller's dramatic exit, the CNN studio was buzzing with activity. Producers were frantically uploading clips to social media, knowing they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Miller's walkout had been captured from multiple camera angles, and the footage of his face during Crockett's document reveals was already being turned into viral content. Crockett remained in her seat as the commercial break played, calmly organizing her documents back into their folder. When Cooper returned to finish the show, she was composed and professional, as if she hadn't just delivered one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory. Congresswoman Crockett, Cooper said, in all my years of hosting political debates, I've never seen anything quite like that. How long have you been preparing those documents? Crockett smiled slightly. Anderson, I've been preparing for Stephen Miller since the day I decided to run for Congress. When you've represented families destroyed by someone's policies, you don't forget. You prepare. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Crockett calmly explaining each document and its significance. But the real action was happening online. Miller meltdown started trending on Twitter within 15 minutes of the debate ending. The hashtag was joined by #Crockett destroys Miller and accountability time. Videos of Miller's speechless moments and eventual walkout were being shared thousands of times per minute. A prominent political commentator tweeted, "Just watched. Jasmine Crockett dismantles Stephen Miller with his own documents. This is what preparation looks like. This is what justice looks like." Conservative media tried to spin the story as an unfair ambush, but the documents spoke for themselves. Even some Republican commentators admitted that Miller had been outplayed. Fox News brought on a panel to discuss the debate, and even they struggled to defend Miller's performance. "Look, Stephen Miller is a smart guy," one panelist said, "but he clearly wasn't prepared for this level of documentation. Crockett did her homework." Meanwhile, progressive media was celebrating Crockett as a new hero. MSNBC ran the clip of Miller walking out on repeat, with commentators praising Crockett's thorough preparation and professional demeanor. But the most powerful reactions came from the families Crockett had represented. Maria Santos, the mother whose daughter had forgotten her voice, posted a video message on social media. "Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett, for giving my daughter a voice when she couldn't speak for herself." The impact extended far beyond social media. Legal experts began analyzing the documents Crockett had presented, with several noting that the internal communications could potentially be used in ongoing lawsuits against the government over family separation policies. Immigration advocacy. Groups immediately began organizing. The National Immigration Law Center announced that they would be using Crockett's research in their own legal challenges. Congresswoman Crockett has provided a roadmap for accountability, their director stated. Miller's team tried damage control, but it was too late. His speaking agency quietly removed him from their roster the next day. 2 universities canceled scheduled appearances. His book publisher called an emergency meeting to discuss whether to proceed with his upcoming memoir. Miller himself remained silent for 3 days before finally posting a statement on social media. "I stand by my service to the American people and my commitment to border security." Political theater and character assassination won't change the fact that strong borders make America safer. But the statement only made things worse. Reply after reply featured screenshots of his own memos, with users asking how family separation made anyone safer. Within hours, the hashtag #MillerOwnWords was trending, with people posting side-by-side comparisons of his public statements versus his private communications. The most damaging response came from an unexpected source: former Trump administration officials who had worked alongside Miller. John Kelly, Trump's former chief of staff, released a statement saying, "While I supported strong border security, the documents released by Congresswoman Crockett reveal a level of callousness that I found troubling even at the time." Other former officials began distancing themselves from Miller's specific policies. Even some who had remained loyal to Trump started drawing distinctions between border security and family separation, clearly trying to avoid being associated with Miller's documented statements. The political ripple effects were immediate and severe. Republican senators who had previously defended Miller's policies suddenly found themselves asked about his breaking eggs comment during interviews. Many struggled to respond, with some simply saying they hadn't seen the documents and would need to review them. Senator Marco Rubio, who had been a strong supporter of tough immigration policies, was forced to clarify his position during a press conference. "I support border security, but I've always believed families should be kept together whenever possible," he said, clearly trying to distance himself from Miller's approach. The damage extended beyond just Miller's personal reputation. Immigration. Advocacy groups began using his own words as evidence in ongoing lawsuits against the government. The American Civil Liberties Union announced they would be incorporating Crockett's documents into their legal challenges, with their director stating, "These documents provide smoking gun evidence of the administration's intent to harm families as a deterrent strategy." Legal experts predicted that Miller's own memos could become key evidence in multiple court cases. When a policy architect writes about acceptable losses and breaking eggs in reference to family separation, it becomes very difficult to argue that harm to children was an unintended consequence, noted one constitutional law professor. Crockett, meanwhile, was flooded with interview requests. She appeared on every major news network over the following week, each time bringing the same calm professionalism and thorough preparation that had destroyed Miller. Her approach was always measured. She let the documents speak for themselves, rather than engaging in personal attacks. "This isn't about Stephen Miller personally," she said in one interview. "This is about accountability. When you design policies that hurt families, you should be prepared to answer for those policies." During a particularly powerful appearance on 60 Minutes, Crockett was joined by Maria Santos, the mother whose daughter had forgotten her voice. The segment showed Santos reuniting with her daughter for the first time after their separation, followed by Crockett reading from Miller's memo about acceptable losses. When Mr. Miller wrote about breaking eggs, Santos said through tears, "My daughter was one of those eggs. But she's not an egg. She's a human being who still has nightmares about being taken from me." The 60 Minutes segment was watched by over 15 million people and shared millions of times on social media. It became one of the most powerful pieces of television journalism of the year, directly connecting Miller's cold policy language to its human impact. International media also picked up the story, with the BBC running a documentary about family. separation that featured extensive footage from the Crockett-Miller debate. European news outlets held up the confrontation as an example of American political accountability, with some noting that such documentation-based challenges were rare in political discourse. The international media impact continued to grow throughout the following weeks. The BBC's documentary featuring the Crockett-Miller debate was translated into multiple languages and sparked discussions about immigration policy in countries around the world. European Parliament members referenced the confrontation during debates about their own immigration policies, with some arguing that Miller's documented callousness represented a cautionary tale about the dangers of dehumanizing immigration enforcement. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked about the debate during a press conference. The documents presented by Congresswoman Crockett remind us why Canada has always prioritized keeping families together in our immigration system, he said, drawing an implicit contrast with Miller's policies. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador went further, calling the debate a moment of truth that exposed the cruelty behind policies that separated thousands of children from their parents. The Mexican government announced they would be using Miller's own memos as evidence in ongoing diplomatic discussions about immigration cooperation. Back in the United States, the academic analysis of the debate continued to expand. Harvard Law School, Miller's own alma mater, organized a symposium on documentation and democratic accountability that featured extensive discussion of Crockett's research methods. Professor Sarah Williams, who taught constitutional law, noted that Crockett's approach represents a new model for how elected officials can use public records to hold former government officials accountable. The symposium attracted over 500 attendees, including journalists, legal scholars, and political activists. Multiple panels analyzed different aspects of the confrontation, from Crockett's research methodology to the legal implications of Miller's documented statements. One panel focused specifically on the role of Freedom of Information Act requests in democratic accountability, with speakers noting that Crockett's success might inspire more systematic efforts to uncover government documents. Several law schools began incorporating the debate into their curricula. At Georgetown Law, Professor Michael Chen developed a semester-long course called Public Records and Democratic Accountability that used Crockett's research as a central case study. She demonstrated that with enough persistence and legal knowledge, it's possible to pierce the veil of government secrecy, Chen explained to his students. The debate also sparked innovation in journalism education. Columbia Journalism School created a new investigative reporting track that emphasized long-term document research and Freedom of Information Act strategies. The program specifically cited Crockett's methodical approach as a model for how non-journalists could conduct accountability research. Meanwhile, the personal toll on Miller continued to mount. Beyond the professional consequences, he found himself facing social ostracism in Washington circles where he had once been influential. Several exclusive clubs and social organizations quietly asked him to resign his memberships, citing the controversy surrounding his documented statements. The social media harassment had also become relentless. Every time Miller appeared in public, photos and videos would surface online within hours, often accompanied by quotes from his own memos. Restaurant visits, shopping trips, and even visits to his doctor's office became public events as people recognized him and documented his presence. Miller's family relationships also suffered. His brother, David Miller, publicly distanced himself from Stephen's policies in an emotional Facebook post that went viral. "I love my brother, but I cannot defend documents that refer to separated children as acceptable losses," David wrote. "Some things are more important than family loyalty, and basic human decency is one of them." The post was shared over 100,000 times and prompted extensive media coverage about the personal cost of political extremism. David Miller appeared on several talk shows, each time emphasizing that his brother's documented callousness had destroyed their relationship. Conservative media attempted various strategies to defend Miller, but the effort largely failed because the evidence was his own words. Fox News initially tried to frame the debate as an unfair ambush, but their own polling showed that even conservative viewers were disturbed by Miller's "breaking eggs" comment. After a week of declining ratings for segments defending Miller, Fox quietly stopped featuring him on their shows. Talk radio hosts who had previously championed Miller's policies found themselves in awkward positions. Rush Limbaugh's successor, Clay Travis, spent an entire show trying to defend Miller, but had to acknowledge that the optics are terrible when you're talking about kids as acceptable losses. Some conservative commentators attempted to argue that Miller's private communications were being taken out of context, but this defense collapsed when additional memos surfaced showing a consistent pattern of dehumanizing language about immigrant families. The National Review, which had previously published Miller's articles, announced they would no longer accept submissions from him. Religious conservative groups, which had been some of Miller's strongest supporters, began withdrawing their backing. The Family Research Council, which had previously invited Miller to speak at their events, issued a statement saying, "We cannot support policies or rhetoric that treats children as acceptable casualties in immigration enforcement." The Southern Baptist Convention, representing millions of conservative Christians, passed a resolution condemning family separation policies and specifically citing Miller's documented statements as incompatible with Christian values of protecting children and preserving families. Even some immigration hardliners began distancing themselves from Miller's specific approach. Mark Krikorian, executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, wrote an op-ed arguing that effective immigration enforcement doesn't require the kind of deliberate cruelty documented in Miller's own memos. The long-term political implications became clearer as polling data emerged. A CNN poll found that 73% of Americans had seen clips from the Crockett-Miller debate, and 68% said the experience made them less likely to support politicians who had worked with Miller. Even among Republican voters, 45% said Miller's documented statements were unacceptable. The polling data had immediate political consequences. Several Republican senators who were considering presidential runs began publicly criticizing family separation policies, clearly trying to distance themselves from Miller's approach. Senator Tim Scott announced that his presidential campaign would include a comprehensive immigration reform plan that prioritized keeping families together. Governor Ron DeSantis, who had previously defended tough immigration enforcement, quietly removed Miller supporters from his campaign staff and began emphasizing his own record of working with immigrant communities in Florida. The debate's impact on congressional races was also significant. Democratic candidates across the country began using clips from the confrontation in their campaign advertisements, while Republican candidates found themselves having to explain their positions on family separation policies. The political implications were enormous. Democratic leadership immediately elevated Crockett's profile, appointing her to the House Judiciary Committee's Immigration Subcommittee. Progressive groups began talking about her as a potential future leader. Republicans, meanwhile, struggled to defend Miller without defending family separation policies that polling showed were deeply unpopular with voters. The debate also changed how political confrontations were covered. Other politicians began bringing documentation to debates, inspired by Crockett's thorough approach. The Crockett method became shorthand for using an opponent's own words against them. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Miller himself. Once considered a potential future presidential candidate, he found himself persona non grata in much of conservative media. His influence in Republican politics, built over years of careful cultivation, had been destroyed in a single evening. 6 months later, Miller announced he was leaving politics entirely to focus on private sector opportunities. Industry insiders noted that even those opportunities were limited, as companies were reluctant to associate with someone whose own memos had revealed such callous disregard for human suffering. Crockett's victory represented something larger than just one debate. It showed that thorough preparation and factual documentation could triumph over political theater and empty rhetoric. It demonstrated